Can you pretend to love me, just for one day? Those were the last words I ever expected to hear from Lucas Bennett, my older brother's best friend, the man I'd quietly loved since I was 18. For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. Lucas wasn't the kind of person who joked about feelings. He was calm, successful, impossible to read, and the type of man who always seemed to know exactly what to say in every situation except the ones that involved his own heart. I stared at him across the small coffee shop, my fingers frozen around an iced latte that had long since melted into watered-down milk. Outside, a warm Saturday breeze carried people past the windows while couples laughed on the sidewalk, completely unaware that my entire world had just tilted sideways. "You don't have to answer right away," Lucas said, rubbing the back of his neck in a way I'd never seen before. He looked nervous. Lucas Bennett was never nervous. "It's just, I need someone to come with me to a wedding next weekend." I managed a weak smile. "And you couldn't find anyone else?" He laughed quietly, but there was something tired behind it. "Not someone I trust." My heartbeat refused to slow down. Every year since my brother Ryan introduced us, Lucas had somehow remained close enough to make my feelings impossible to forget, but far enough away that they never had a chance to become anything real. Family barbecues, Thanksgiving dinners, football Sundays, graduation, my first apartment. Somehow Lucas was always there, smiling, encouraging me, asking about school or work, completely unaware that every casual conversation stayed with me for weeks afterward. I had spent years convincing myself that admiration was enough, that watching him build the life he wanted should be enough, that someday I'd stop noticing how safe I felt whenever he walked into a room. I never did. Lucas reached into the inside pocket of his navy blazer and slid a cream-colored invitation across the table. Gold lettering shimmered under the cafe lights. The wedding belonged to one of his biggest clients, someone who apparently believed bringing a significant other was practically mandatory. "Everyone there expects me to show up with someone," he admitted. "If I go alone, I'll spend the entire evening answering questions I'd rather avoid." "So you need a fake boyfriend?" He nodded once. "Just for the ceremony, dinner, and a few pictures." I should have said no. Any sensible person would have. Pretending to date the man I'd secretly loved for years sounded less like a favor and more like emotional torture wrapped in an expensive suit. But then Lucas looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw uncertainty instead of confidence. It made him seem unexpectedly human. "Ethan," he said softly. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. My name sounded different coming from him that afternoon, warmer somehow, almost careful. I looked down at the invitation again, tracing the embossed letters with my thumb while my thoughts raced faster than I could control. One fake date, one wedding, one unforgettable day standing beside the only man I'd ever wanted to call mine, even if it was all make-believe. Without realizing it, I smiled. "Okay," I whispered. "I'll be your fake boyfriend." I didn't know it then, but that single promise was about to blur every line I'd spent years trying so hard not to cross. The moment I agreed, Lucas let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like relief, and for a second I wondered how long he had been carrying the weight of asking me. He smiled in a way I had never seen before, softer than his usual confident expression, as if a problem that had followed him for weeks had finally found a solution. "Thank you," he said. "You have no idea how much this means to me." I tried to laugh it off, even though my heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it across the table. "You owe me a really good dinner after this." "Deal," he answered without hesitation. "Actually, several dinners. This favor deserves interest." I raised an eyebrow. "Interest? I am a businessman. Everything comes with interest." That earned a genuine laugh from both of us, and somehow the tension melted just enough for me to breathe again. Before leaving the coffee shop, Lucas opened the wedding invitation once more and showed me the schedule. The ceremony would begin at 4 in the afternoon the following Saturday at a historic vineyard just outside the city. Cocktail hour, dinner, speeches, dancing, and photographs would stretch well into the evening. "It is going to be a long day," he admitted, "which means we need to make this believable." I swallowed. "How believable?" "People know me. They ask questions. They notice everything." He paused before adding, "Especially my friends." My stomach tightened. I had expected to smile for a few pictures and survive a few awkward conversations. Instead, Lucas calmly explained that we would need a believable story about how we met, how long we had been dating, what my job was, what his favorite habits were, and even who usually cooked dinner. You already know I cannot cook, I teased. Exactly, he replied with a grin. That part will not require acting. During the drive home, he suggested we spend the week preparing together. We would shop for matching outfits, practice introductions, and make sure neither of us hesitated if someone asked personal questions. Every new detail made the arrangement feel less like a simple favor and more like stepping into another life. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Lucas. It was a photo of 2 tailored suits displayed in the window of an upscale men's boutique downtown. Which one feels more like you? He asked. I stared at the screen longer than I probably should have before answering that the charcoal gray suit looked timeless. A minute later, another message appeared. Good. I was hoping you would choose that one because it matches mine. Somehow that tiny sentence stayed with me for the rest of the night. It was only about clothing, yet it felt strangely personal. Over the next few days, the messages became more frequent. Good morning. Do you drink sparkling water or still water at formal dinners? Do you mind dancing if someone asks? What is your favorite dessert? Every conversation sounded practical on the surface, but together they slowly filled the spaces between us that had always been empty. For the first time since I had met Lucas Bennett, I was learning things that no one else in my family had ever noticed, and without realizing it, pretending to be close was beginning to feel remarkably similar to actually becoming close. By Thursday afternoon, pretending no longer felt like an idea. It had become a routine. Lucas picked me up outside my apartment exactly at 3 o'clock, as punctual as always, and together we headed toward the boutique he had mentioned earlier that week. The moment we stepped inside, the tailor greeted Lucas by name before turning to me with an easy smile that immediately made one assumption. It is good to finally meet you, he said. Lucas has talked about this event for weeks. I glanced toward Lucas, expecting him to correct the misunderstanding, but instead he simply smiled and replied, We have been looking forward to it. That tiny sentence should not have mattered, yet hearing him say the word we instead of I sent an unexpected warmth through my chest. The fitting took nearly an hour. The charcoal gray suit fit almost perfectly after only a few adjustments, while Lucas chose a deep navy suit that somehow made his blue eyes stand out even more. Standing side by side in front of the mirror, we looked surprisingly natural together. Even the tailor stepped back with a satisfied nod. You two balance each other well, he said. One is calm, the other brings warmth. It shows. Lucas caught my reflection in the mirror and laughed quietly. Apparently, we make a convincing team already. I forced myself to smile even though my heartbeat had become impossible to ignore. After leaving the boutique, Lucas suggested we rehearse over an early dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant overlooking the river. Instead of ordering immediately, he pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. Quiz time, he announced with mock seriousness. What is my favorite dessert? Cheesecake, I answered without thinking. His eyebrows lifted. You remembered. I shrugged, trying to hide my embarrassment. You ordered it every Thanksgiving at my brother's house. He smiled for a moment before asking another question. What do I always drink in the morning? Black coffee. No sugar. Again, he looked genuinely surprised. I never told you. That. I laughed softly. You never had to. For the first time since this arrangement began, silence settled comfortably between us instead of awkwardly. Lucas closed the notebook. Maybe we do not need as much practice as I thought. We spent the rest of dinner talking about everything except the wedding. Childhood memories. Favorite movies. Vacation dreams. The places we still hope to visit someday. I learned that Lucas had always wanted to see the northern lights in Alaska, while I admitted I had never even left the country. He listened with a level of attention that made every answer feel important, never checking his phone, never looking over my shoulder, never making me feel like he had somewhere better to be. As the evening sun dipped below the skyline, we walked slowly along the river before heading back to his car. A cool breeze rolled across the water, and without saying anything, Lucas took off his suit jacket and draped it over my shoulders. You look cold, he said simply. I started to protest, but the familiar scent of cedar and clean linen surrounding the jacket stole the words from my mouth. We stood there for a quiet moment, watching the city lights reflect across the water, neither of us speaking because somehow the silence said enough. Then Lucas looked at me with an expression I still could not quite understand and asked one unexpected question. Ethan, Has anyone ever told you that you are much easier to be around than almost everyone I know? I smiled before answering honestly. No, you are the first. Neither of us realized that somewhere across the street, someone had quietly raised a phone, snapped a picture of us standing together beneath the evening lights, and walked away with a smile that suggested our carefully planned performance was already beginning to convince people who had never even heard our story. Saturday arrived faster than either of us expected. By early afternoon, I stood in front of my apartment mirror adjusting the charcoal gray tie for what felt like the 10th time. Every attempt somehow looked worse than the last until my phone buzzed with a simple message from Lucas. I am outside. When I opened the front door, he was leaning against his car wearing the navy suit we had chosen together, looking polished as always. But the moment he saw me, his expression softened into a smile that lingered just a little longer than usual. "You clean up pretty well," he said. I laughed nervously. That sounds almost like a compliment. It was meant to be one. During the hour-long drive to the vineyard, we reviewed our imaginary relationship one final time. We had supposedly met through a mutual charity event nearly a year ago. Our first date had been at a neighborhood bookstore followed by dinner at a small family-owned restaurant. Lucas supposedly burned pancakes every Sunday morning, while I insisted on making coffee before either of us spoke more than 5 words. The details sounded surprisingly believable because we had spent the entire week building them together. Somewhere along the way, the fictional memories had started feeling oddly familiar. As the vineyard appeared beyond the rolling hills, rows of grapevines stretched across the landscape beneath a clear blue sky, and elegant white decorations surrounded the ceremony lawn. Luxury cars filled the parking area while guests in colorful formal clothing gathered near the entrance with glasses of sparkling cider and lemonade. My confidence disappeared almost instantly. "Lucas," I admitted quietly, "I think I forgot how to breathe." He looked at me for a second before offering his hand. "Then start with this." I stared at his outstretched hand. "People expect couples to walk in together," he explained gently. "Only if you are comfortable." The hesitation lasted barely a second before I placed my hand in his. His grip was warm, steady, and reassuring rather than performative. Instead of making me more nervous, it somehow grounded me. We crossed the entrance together, and almost immediately several guests greeted Lucas by name. Every introduction came naturally. "This is Ethan," Lucas said with an easy smile. "I have been looking forward to introducing him to everyone." There was no hesitation in his voice, no sign that any of it was rehearsed. The conversations flowed effortlessly until a cheerful older woman with silver hair stepped toward us holding a camera. "Finally," she said, "I have heard so much about you two." Before I could respond, she laughed and added, "Stand closer. Couples always leave too much space in photographs." My heart nearly stopped. Without saying a word, Lucas slipped his arm gently around my back, closing the small distance between us. The movement was respectful and natural, just enough to make the photograph believable, yet close enough that I could hear his calm breathing beside me. The camera flashed once. Then again. Everyone smiled. Nobody questioned a thing. As the photographer walked away, Lucas quietly lowered his hand but did not step away immediately. "You are doing great," he whispered so only I could hear. I looked toward the ceremony lawn where dozens of strangers smiled at us as though we belonged together. And for one dangerous moment, I caught myself wishing none of this had to end when the wedding was over. I did not notice the tall man standing near the reception tent watching us with unmistakable curiosity until his expression changed from surprise to recognition, and the slow smile that spread across his face suggested he knew Lucas far better than either of us realized. The ceremony itself unfolded beneath a bright blue sky as a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers through the vineyard. Lucas and I took our seats among the other guests, close enough that our shoulders brushed whenever someone stood or shifted in the row ahead of us. Every now and then he leaned over to quietly explain who someone was or share a light-hearted comment about the couple, and each whispered conversation made the space between us feel smaller. By the time everyone moved toward the reception hall, pretending had begun to feel surprisingly effortless. During cocktail hour, we were introduced to more of Lucas's colleagues than I could possibly remember. Every handshake came with warm smiles, polite questions, and the same assumption that Lucas never corrected. Instead, he naturally included me in every conversation. "Ethan has better taste than I do," he joked while complimenting the floral arrangements. He would have picked these colors. Immediately, I looked at him with quiet surprise because I had never actually shared an opinion about the decorations. Somehow, he had simply found another reason to make me feel included. Just as dinner was about to begin, the tall man I had noticed earlier approached our table, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling cider. He greeted Lucas with the confidence of someone who had known him for years before turning his attention toward me. "So you must be Ethan," he said with an amused smile. "I am Daniel Foster. Lucas and I worked together for almost 5 years." We shook hands politely before Daniel looked back at Lucas with an expression that mixed curiosity and disbelief. "You certainly know how to surprise people." Lucas remained calm. "Life is full of surprises." Daniel chuckled. "That is not what surprises me." He folded his arms casually before adding, "You spent years telling everyone that work always came first. Every time someone tried to set you up on a date, you found a reason to leave early. Then suddenly you arrive with someone you seem genuinely happy around." I noticed several nearby guests glance toward our table with quiet interest. The conversation had become impossible to ignore. Daniel smiled kindly rather than critically, but his next question carried enough weight to make my pulse quicken. "Tell me something, Lucas. When exactly did this happen?" There was a brief silence. I opened my mouth, ready to repeat the carefully memorized story we had practiced all week. But before I could say a single word, Lucas answered first. "Around the time I stopped looking for the person everyone expected me to choose and started paying attention to the person who made ordinary days feel easier." My eyes shifted toward him in surprise. "That was not part of our plan." Daniel studied Lucas for several seconds before laughing softly. "Now that sounds like the most honest thing I have ever heard you say." The tension around the table dissolved into comfortable conversation as dinner was served, yet my thoughts remained fixed on Lucas's unexpected answer. It had sounded too natural to be rehearsed and too personal to dismiss completely. Later, as music filled the reception hall and couples slowly gathered on the dance floor for the first dance of the evening, Lucas turned toward me with the same calm smile he had worn all day and quietly held out his hand once again. "Would my boyfriend honor me with one dance?" he asked. The room suddenly felt very still. Every careful boundary we had drawn between pretending and reality seemed to blur a little more, and without fully understanding why, I realized I wanted to know whether the warmth in his voice had been another convincing performance or the first glimpse of something neither of us had planned to discover. My hand found his before my mind had the chance to overthink it. Lucas smiled, gently curling his fingers around mine as he led me toward the center of the dance floor where dozens of other couples were already swaying beneath strings of warm lights. The band played a slow, familiar melody, soft enough that conversations continued around the room without interrupting the music. I had never considered myself much of a dancer, but Lucas seemed to notice my hesitation immediately. "Relax," he said with a reassuring smile. "Nobody is grading us." I laughed quietly. "Easy for you to say. You actually know what you are doing." "Not really," he admitted. "I just learned that confidence makes people think you know what you are doing." That answer somehow made me feel better. He rested one hand lightly against my shoulder while I mirrored his movements, and within a few moments we found an easy rhythm. There was nothing dramatic about the dance. No elaborate steps. No perfect choreography. Just 2 people moving slowly while the rest of the reception faded into the background. Every now and then Lucas looked at me instead of the crowd, smiling whenever I accidentally stepped half an inch in the wrong direction. Instead of teasing me, he quietly adjusted our pace until we were moving together again. "See," he whispered, "you are a fast learner. Only because you are patient." His smile lingered for a second longer than usual. That goes both ways. The song ended far sooner than I wanted, but before either of us stepped away, the master of ceremonies announced another dance and invited everyone to remain on the floor. Several guests clapped while others laughed and encouraged the couples around them to stay together. Lucas looked at me with a questioning expression. "One more?" I nodded without hesitation. As the next song began, an older couple dancing nearby smiled warmly at us. The woman leaned toward me with bright, kind eyes. "You two remind me of my husband and me when we first started dating," she said. "You keep looking at each other like you are still discovering something." Her husband chuckled. "Do not let that feeling disappear. Life moves faster than you expect." Before either Lucas or I could respond, They drifted away with the music, leaving their simple advice lingering between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. We simply continued dancing, letting the comfortable silence settle naturally. Eventually, Lucas glanced toward the windows overlooking the vineyard. The evening sky had turned shades of deep orange and soft purple as the sun slipped below the hills. "Would you like to get some fresh air?" he asked. We quietly stepped outside onto the stone terrace where tiny lights wrapped around the railings overlooked rows of grapevines stretching into the distance. The cooler evening air carried the scent of lavender and fresh grass, replacing the lively sounds of the reception with peaceful silence. We stood side by side without saying anything until Lucas finally spoke. "Thank you for today, Ethan." I smiled. "We still have the rest of the evening." He shook his head gently. "That is not what I mean." His voice became unusually thoughtful. For the first time in a long time, I forgot I was pretending. Those words settled deep inside me before I could decide what they meant. I searched his face for an explanation, but just then his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and the warmth in his expression faded almost instantly. Without another word, he slipped the phone back into his pocket, stared toward the darkening vineyard, and quietly whispered, "I was hoping this conversation could wait a little longer." Lucas remained quiet for the rest of the evening, and although he never stopped smiling whenever another guest approached us, I could tell something had shifted. It was subtle, almost impossible for anyone else to notice. But after spending the past week paying attention to every small expression on his face, I could see the difference. His eyes lingered on his phone more often. His answers became shorter whenever the screen lit up. Still, he never let go of the role we had agreed to play. When dinner ended and guests gathered outside to watch the newly married couple leave beneath a tunnel of sparklers, Lucas instinctively found my hand again, intertwining our fingers as naturally as if we had done it 100 times before. Nobody questioned us. Nobody looked surprised. In fact, several people smiled at us with the kind of quiet approval usually reserved for couples who clearly belong together. On the drive back to the city, neither of us spoke very much. The peaceful silence that had once felt comforting now carried unanswered questions. About 20 minutes from my apartment, Lucas finally broke it. "I am sorry if I seemed distracted tonight." I turned toward him. "Was everything all right?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Just work. It can wait." I wanted to ask more, but something about his tone told me he was not ready to talk. When he pulled up outside my building, he turned off the engine but made no move to leave. The streetlights reflected softly across the windshield as we sat there for a few quiet moments. Then he smiled, though it looked more tired than before. "Thank you again, Ethan. I could not have done today without you." Before I could answer, he leaned over just enough to straighten the slightly crooked collar of my jacket. The gesture was brief, careful, and unexpectedly gentle. "Get some rest," he said. "You deserve it." I watched his car disappear down the street before walking upstairs with a heart that felt far heavier than it had that morning. By Sunday afternoon, I convinced myself everything would return to normal. The fake relationship had served its purpose. Lucas would go back to his demanding career, and I would return to my ordinary routine, carrying memories that had never truly belonged to me. Monday came without a message. Tuesday passed the same way. On Wednesday morning, I almost reached for my phone to text him before stopping myself. He had thanked me. The arrangement was over. There was no reason to keep finding excuses to talk. By Friday evening, even the simple good morning messages we had exchanged all week before the wedding had disappeared completely. I told myself not to overthink it, yet every notification that was not from Lucas felt strangely disappointing. That weekend, my brother Ryan invited me over to watch a baseball game, insisting it had been too long since we had spent time together. We settled onto the couch with pizza and soft drinks while the television played quietly in the background. Halfway through the second inning, Ryan muted the game and looked at me with an expression that immediately caught my attention. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded. "Did something happen between you and Lucas?" My heart skipped. I tried to sound casual. "Why would you ask that?" Ryan studied me for a long moment before reaching for his phone. Without saying another word, he opened a photograph and handed it to me. It was the picture taken outside the vineyard a few nights earlier, the one of Lucas standing close beside me with his jacket resting over my shoulders as we smiled at each other beneath the evening lights. Then Ryan quietly said the one sentence I never expected to hear. "You should know." Lucas asked me about you months before he ever invited you to that wedding. For several seconds, I could not find a single word to answer my brother. I simply stared at the photograph on his phone, remembering how natural everything had felt that evening. Months before, I finally managed to ask. Ryan nodded slowly and leaned back against the couch. He invited me out for lunch one day. At first, we talked about work, but then he started asking questions about you. Nothing strange at first. He wanted to know whether you were happy at your new job, whether you still enjoyed photography, whether you had plans to move out of the city someday. I frowned. That does not mean anything. Ryan smiled knowingly. That is exactly what I thought until he kept asking. My heartbeat grew louder with every sentence. He wanted to know your favorite coffee order. He asked what kind of movies you actually liked because he realized he had only seen you watch whatever everyone else picked. He even asked whether you were seeing anyone. I looked down at my hands, trying to make sense of everything. What did you tell him? The truth, Ryan replied. That you always seemed interested in someone, but never talked about it. He paused before adding. Lucas looked disappointed for about 2 seconds. Then he asked if you had ever mentioned who that person was. I closed my eyes briefly. You did not tell him. Ryan laughed. I had no idea it was him. The room fell quiet. Suddenly, dozens of small moments from the previous week returned to me with completely different meaning. The notebook full of questions that he had barely needed to use. The way he already knew which suit he hoped I would choose. The dinners. The walks. The conversations that had drifted far away from wedding preparations. Even the answer he gave Daniel during the reception no longer sounded like clever improvisation. It sounded honest. Ryan reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. There is one more thing. He handed it to me. It was a reservation confirmation from a small restaurant overlooking the harbor, dated almost 3 weeks before the wedding. 2 guests. 8 o'clock. At the bottom was a handwritten note in Lucas's familiar handwriting. If I lose my nerve again, remind me that some chances do not come twice. I stared at the words in disbelief. He never used this reservation, Ryan explained. He called me that afternoon and canceled because he said asking you out directly might make things awkward for both of you if you did not feel the same way. My chest tightened. So the wedding. Ryan smiled gently. The wedding invitation was real. Needing someone to attend with him was real too. But I think he finally saw it as the excuse he had been waiting for. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated for the first time in nearly a week. Lucas's name appeared on the screen, and my pulse immediately quickened. The message was surprisingly short. I owe you an explanation. If you are free, could we meet tonight at the river where we walked after the suit fitting? I read the message twice before looking back at Ryan, who simply smiled as though he had been expecting it all along. As the sun began to set outside the window, I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, realizing that the conversation I had been replaying in my mind since the wedding had never truly ended. It had only been waiting for both of us to stop pretending. The river looked exactly as I remembered it from the night we had walked there after the suit fitting, quiet and peaceful beneath the glow of the city lights. The breeze carried the familiar scent of fresh water, and for a brief moment it felt as though the past week had folded back onto itself. Lucas was already there, standing near the railing with both hands in the pockets of his jacket. When he noticed me approaching, he smiled with obvious relief, but there was also a nervousness I had never seen in him before. Thank you for coming, he said softly. I stopped beside him, leaving only a small space between us. Ryan told me everything. Lucas lowered his eyes for a moment before letting out a slow breath. Then you already know I was not completely honest. I shook my head gently. The wedding was real. It was. Needing someone to go with you was real. Yes. He smiled faintly before looking directly at me. But asking you was never just about the wedding. The honesty in his voice made every question I had carried for years suddenly feel lighter. Lucas rested his forearms against the railing as he looked out over the water. I almost asked you to dinner weeks before that invitation arrived. I even made a reservation. He laughed quietly at himself. Then I convinced myself you probably saw me as nothing more than your brother's friend. I canceled because I was afraid of making you uncomfortable. I smiled without meaning to. I spent years thinking you only saw me as Ryan's little brother. He turned toward me with genuine surprise. Years? I nodded. Since I was 18. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Lucas laughed in disbelief and covered his face with one hand. So we were both waiting for the other person to say something. Apparently. The silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was filled with the quiet relief of finally understanding everything that had gone unsaid. Lucas stepped a little closer, his expression warm and sincere. When I asked you to pretend, I thought one evening together might help me figure out whether what I felt was real. He smiled gently. Instead, every hour made it harder to remember we were pretending at all. I felt my heart settle into a calm rhythm I had never experienced around him before. I thought I was the only one who wished the wedding would never end. Lucas slowly reached for my hand, giving me every chance to step away if I wanted to. I did not. Our fingers fit together naturally, just as they had throughout that unforgettable weekend. Except this time there was no audience, no rehearsed story, and no reason to perform. I do not need a fake boyfriend anymore, he said quietly. I only want the chance to be your real one, if that is something you still want. I smiled so widely that my cheeks actually hurt. I thought you would never ask. His answering smile was brighter than any I had seen before, and in that simple moment, every imaginary memory we had invented for the wedding was replaced by the beginning of a real one. Months later, whenever friends asked how we started dating, Lucas would always grin before looking at me. It is a long story, he would say. I would laugh, squeeze his hand, and answer the part he always left out. The funny thing is that the only fake part was how it began. Everything that mattered afterward was completely real.